So Hans, this past week we got new information. Effectively, I think of it as confirmation of something that we've both written about, many times, talked about many times. It's something that I've written about going back to 2019, and that is the role of these outside legal participants. In particular, a guy by the name of Norm Eisen, a Brookings fellow who has effectively acted as outside legal counsel for pretty much every legal action against Trump. And we're talking about going back to first the Mueller investigation, where he ran a parallel legal counsel process effectively for Mueller. During that, he then went over and became impeachment counsel for the Dems. He ran war games in the 2020 election, which were shockingly accurate in their predictions. He then began to work with, produce legal reports and work with none other than Fani Willis and Jack Smith. He was running effectively parallel legal investigations into each case. And basically, they were so detailed that, say, in the case of Fani Willis, she literally could have cut and pasted what Eisen did into her cases. Indeed, I think she probably did that. So it's this deep, deep operative. And with this past week, we got confirmation that there's these ongoing sequence of teleconferences that are taking place weekly, and they include a who's who of names that are known to everybody. Think kind of MSNBC legal counsel, Andrew Weissman, Rubin, George Conway, all of these people. Well, they're all on these weekly conference calls, and the person that's heading this conference call is none other than Norm Eisen. And who's helping him out? Mary McCabe, the infamous DOJ NSD official under the Obama administration. She was involved in the targeting of General Flynn. She was involved in the FISA surveillance of Carter Page et al. So it appears that, we now have confirmation of something that we've been talking about for a long time, which is these coordinated legal attacks on Trump that are effectively being run outside of the official prosecutors by former officials within the Obama administration. So that's kind of the backdrop.
It is. And I think the wider picture here, the broader picture that is immediately triggered is that you have outside forces, third parties, running official government business. Prosecutions is part of the executive branch of government. It's not the role of private parties to run prosecutions. That's illegal. And yet, by using people like this guy Eisen, the whole process is circumvented. And what you, of course, get when you do that, when you have Eisen basically writing the playbook, as you described, for not only the current Trump prosecutions, but even the Mueller special counsel, witch hunt, then you avoid the checks and balances of government. Now, let's be honest. With Democrats in charge of everything and the media and so on, maybe it's the case that there isn't much in the way of checks and balances anyway. But in theory, anyway, nominally, we're still supposed to have that. And we're not having it when these third parties openly run the show. And that's really the problem here. And of course, it didn't start with these Trump prosecutions. It didn't even start in 2020. In 2020, we had Mark Zuckerberg take over official government functions in terms of running these elections. Again, that's not supposed to happen. The government is supposed to operate government business based on government actors doing that using government money. And of course, in 2020, all of that was thrown out the window. We had Zuckerberg come in and take over. But of course, I think it goes back a lot further. Think of the Steele dossier. You basically outsourced a phony investigation to a phony British washed-up spy. It's a bit more fuzzy because, he was outside and people would argue, well, he wasn't really FBI, whatever. But you get the point, right? That we have this constant theme now for at least 8, 9, 10 years of non-government actors taking over very important government functions. And you're just not supposed to have that. And, before I pass it back to you, I think we should mention these NGOs as well. And we're probably going to have more time to talk about them later as well, where NGOs are basically empowered by people in government to do the government's business. Look at these NGOs in Ukraine who were basically running that country, advising on how to do this and that, and setting up the anti-corruption, all this crap they did. That was all NGOs funded by the State Department. Again, these are not accountable to anyone. They weren't elected by anyone. So it's worse than the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, deep state, what we always talk about, that's very, very bad. Those are non-accountable, whatever. But theoretically, these people at least work for the government. Theoretically, they're at least fireable. Theoretically, there's at least some way of holding them to account, or at least seeing what they're doing, like FOIA. You can FOIA them, right? Well, that's a story on its own, but you know what I mean. But with these third parties, whether it's Eisen, whether it's NGOs, whether it's whoever, you don't have that. And that's the danger. And it's more than a danger. Right now, it's a total catastrophe.
Well, and on the NGOs, it's the NGOs that are currently driving the illegal immigration. And again, once again, being funded by the State Department. Now, we'll come back to that. But I think, this direction, it kind of leads us to this larger picture that you've touched on that I think is really important to emphasize. And, once again, what we're effectively seeing is this outsourcing of the dirty work to these sort of closely affiliated but effectively off the books parties. You mentioned Christopher Steele. So what happens? Who is the person that hires him? Well, it's Mark Elias when he was at Perkins Coie, and brings him in along with Sussman. Those two sort of worked in tandem for a long time. But, they get Fusion GPS, they hire them. And Fusion then turns around and hires Steele, and then they go ahead and begin with the dossier and all the chaos that ensued from that, including affecting our foreign policy to this day. Then I would point to another element. Obviously you talked about the NGOs, and we'll come back to that. But think about what happened in late 2016. Everybody was confident that Hillary Clinton, at least publicly, was confident that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. There was one guy on the DNC side who wasn't so confident publicly, and that was a gentleman by the name of Ben Witz, who ran the Lawfare web blog. He's also, like Norm Eisen, he's a Brookings Fellow. He's actually very closely affiliated with Norm Eisen. I think they're good friends. And, Witz came out with, it was a call to a coalition of all Democratic forces. It was basically an open letter that he published in an article that was saying, hey, what if Trump wins? Now, I'm guessing he knew perfectly well Trump was going to win. I think they had access to data that showed that the election was very different than what the public perceived it to be. And what he was calling for was for everybody, all his legal friends, to come together and form a loose group, a coalition, that would engage in nonstop lawfare against the potential Trump presidency. And indeed, that's exactly what they did. It's kind of interesting because Witz actually then later re-edited his entire article and cut out a lot of parts of it. We called him out on that. And the funny thing, I forgot to tell you this, but I went in the other day, and after posting all the pieces that he cut out, they're back. He unrestricted it. So that article is now back in its original form after having been edited out for, 2 years. But at any rate, that's kind of showing this foundation, and Eisen typifies this as well. He paralleled the Mueller investigation, where he's literally doing all the deep legal work. He made the case, and these aren't small reports. We're talking 300-page reports with appendices. And he was making the case for obstruction, whereby Mueller could refer obstruction charges on Trump to Congress. He laid out the foundation for the impeachment charges. A full month before Nancy Pelosi ever drew up impeachment charges against Trump, Eisen later bragged that he drafted no less than 12 different articles of impeachment on Trump. So there's one other element that I think goes in hand with a lot of these people. We've sort of got the deep state, the entrenched bureaucrats, but then people like Eisen, they typically tend to be former Obama officials. So if we're trying to characterize it, that's who these people generally seem to be. And they come together informally, off the books. They're always well-funded. Eisen's getting funded by both Brookings and by Crew. I'm sure they have plenty of other funding sources. But unlike anything the GOP does, these guys are very good at coalescing and doing all of this incredible work. And like you said, the larger issue is it's being done effectively off the books. They're unofficially doing the things that our government can't actually do directly, or at least shouldn't.
Right. And they kind of, it's like almost a brain trust. It's kind of, they come up with these ideas that even government bureaucrats might not or would not or whatever. Take that Section 1512 for example, right? I mean, I think that's one of the charges that was brought against Trump on obstruction in terms of the January 6th protests. And that's the one that the Supreme Court is looking at right now, because it's also the basis for a lot of the charges that were brought against the January 6th protesters. And I think all but one of the judges in all these cases, I mean, there's so many cases, went along with that theory that 1512 somehow applies. And we'll come back here in a moment to what 1512 is. I'll try and get into that and explain why this is so completely crazy. But I think the craziest part is, and that's why I want to kind of jump to the conclusion here, is that it was Eisen who came up with that idea. That was his idea. That was his playbook. And so it's amazing, isn't it, that these anti-Trump forces, and I wouldn't only call them anti-Trump forces, they're basically anti-democracy forces, because, as you said, they have seized the control of government levers of power in private hands. I mean, that is the most anti-democratic, undemocratic thing in that you could ever think of. Well, it's happening. Well, with 1512, I don't want to, bore everyone with the details, but I think it's worthwhile recounting, because Andrew Weissman makes an appearance, and there's a lot of kind of parallels here to the past, and the same characters appearing again. Section 1512 is the Arthur Andersen law. It's the Enron law. So that's why, a lot of people are asking, well, what's Trump got to do with Arthur Andersen, right? And that's a very legitimate question. So what happened is that Arthur Andersen was an accounting firm in the US, one of the biggest. And when they found out that one of their clients, Enron, was in trouble, they started just getting rid of the files. They just started shredding them. There's nothing illegal about that. I mean, a company has its own retention policies. In their case, they had exceeded their own policies, so they can go ahead and delete whatever they want. And that's what they did. Well, I say delete, they actually physically shredded stuff. Okay, fine. And then they were prosecuted, and then they were convicted, the company, the accounting firm. Now, if an accounting firm is convicted, it can no longer do accounting. It's not possible. So Arthur Andersen was killed off, company dead, okay, huge company. Guess what happened? The thing was appealed. That's where Weissman comes in, and they lost 9-0. So the government lost 9-0. Now, back then, I don't think Norm Eisen, anyone was involved with that. But the point is that the government was already abusing that law, because again, without getting into too many details, the law was about, in the same sense of what we're talking about now, disrupting an official proceeding. In that case, the official proceeding was the investigation into Enron. And if you delete files, you disrupt that proceeding. But, for kind of various reasons, but the main one I've already mentioned, the fact that there's nothing against deleting your own files, according to your own company's policies. Nothing wrong with that. That's what they did. So anyway, by the time Arthur Andersen won the case, the company was already dead. All these people, thousands of people unemployed, thousands of careers destroyed, all that kind of stuff. That was Weissman and a couple of these other people whose names we keep hearing again. Okay, now fast forward 20-something years, and that same law is used against Trump and these January 6 people. You think, what? The law was about disrupting an official proceeding by destroying evidence. That's what it says. And then there's that one word in there, or otherwise. Laws often have that kind of sort of catch-all clause, like destroying or deleting or whatever, or otherwise. Just throw that in there. Now, as lawyers, you don't have to interpret. Does the or otherwise mean anything on the planet, or does it mean destroying or deleting, or some kind of derivative thesaurus, use a thesaurus for those words, just some synonym of those words? And that's what the Supreme Court is looking at right now, because and I think they will find that this is an Enron law, this is about destroying documents, this is not about, going to a protest. And so it wouldn't catch Trump, it wouldn't catch the January 6th people. And so I think that's going to be thrown out. But the mere idea, now this is where the circle closes, I know I've gone on here for a while, the mere idea that you take 1512, the Arthur Andersen Enron law about destroying documents, and you to conjure up this legal theory that somehow you can use that against Trump. That is what these people do. That's why I say this is the brain trust of these anti-democratic forces. That's what they do all day long. They just come up with the craziest stuff, and then the government people, the prosecutors, run with it. That's the even crazier part. And the case of 1512 shows me personally how completely under the thumb the U.S. government bureaucrats, especially DOJ, you mentioned McCord, all these people, are in terms of these outside groups, of these outside parties. Because anyone who wasn't completely under their control or mental control or intellectual or whatever would say 1512, are you nuts? Why would we ever use 1512 for Trump or January 6th or whatever? And yet they're doing it.
Well, the reason that I was looking down for so long while you were talking wasn't that I wasn't listening to you, but I was trying to quickly pull some things up, because as soon as you mentioned Section 1512, it immediately had me, I knew we had some stuff on this. And here's the genesis of it. You asked, kind of like where it came from. Well, obviously we go back to Enron. But the first person to mention 1512 that I know of in more recent times was none other than Ben Witz. And he wrote about it in a June 2nd, 2017 article. And he has said here, it's possible that 1512, this is Ben Witz, it's possible that 1512 is the more appropriate statutory provision. It also happens to be easier to prove because it doesn't require a quote unquote pending proceeding. Now, at the time he said it, bear in mind, June 2nd, 2017, Mueller had just been appointed. We mentioned earlier that Norm Eisen both worked with Mueller and was close with Witz. What did Eisen do? Well, he produced two reports, the first of which came out in October 17, and then he came out with a second, more lengthy volume. By the way, this is a pattern that Eisen does. Comes out with a first overview and then goes in and dives in and gets into the real specifics. In his second piece accompanying the Mueller investigation, it was Norm Eisen who focused almost the entirety of his report on Section 1512 and how it could be applied to the to Mueller's investigation of Trump. And of course, they later carried that over to, impeachment and then brought it up in this current legal process. So right there, as soon as you said that, that's why I immediately started trying to pull up those articles, because I wanted to get the details specific. These are some old articles that we'd written, but I couldn't remember the dates, etc. So again, we see how this stuff is brought up and the way it's done. All Witz had to do was sort of say it publicly, write it. That sends out a clarion call. It was a direction, clearly, to everybody else. Weissman immediately seizes on it, so much so that he makes this obscure, little-used provision that's overly broad and uses it as the entirety of the focus of his second report for Mueller to use, which Mueller then does.
And of course, he would have known about it because he lost the Enron case. He knew everything about that.
Yeah, you're speaking of Weissman as well, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Weissman was really running the Mueller investigation. And by the way, I think we mentioned, but just to make sure, Weissman is part of these weekly phone calls with Norm Eisen and Mary McCord. It's a who's who list. It's literally, if you can think of, kind of anybody that comes to mind in terms of all the legal people that you think of. I'm looking quickly to see if we've got a listing of these people, but it's... Here we've got Barbara McQuaid, Norman Ornstein, Bill Crystal, Lawrence Tribe, Noah Bookbinder, Barry Burke, Asha Rangappa, probably said that wrong, but whatever, Jennifer Rubin, Jeffrey Toobin, George Conway, Renato Mariotta. So it's literally a who's who of like the MSNBC legal contributors. And you can see right there, that's another prong of their strategy. So what they really are is their DNC paid at legal activists who run parallel legal, outside legal counsel case. They're really doing the real legal work that's used by sort of the figureheads of the actual attacks on Trump. They're running it. And then they're the same people that are hired by the media outlets, CNN and MSNBC, to go ahead and promote this stuff every day. And that is what's going on.
And once in a while, most of these people get a little, Biden gives them a little something, or Obama gives them a little something in government. Because, of course, what that does is it kind of renews the whole cycle. Like, if these people have been out of government for too long, the media can't use this label, like Andrew Weissman, former senior whatever DOJ, or Mary McCord, senior, these labels are important for the media to give these people a semblance of credibility. If they just say, so-and-so of some group, that's not the same as saying like, oh, used to be number 4 at DOJ or whatever, right? So, but then they ping pong in and out of government precisely for that reason. So in government to just quickly gain a bit of credibility, cause some chaos, but then go out of government to cause real chaos. And then, after 5 or whatever years, they're going to be back in for it's absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the great irony here, right? Is the very thing that lends them credibility on the MSNBC, CNN, et cetera, is the very thing that they're actually doing. It's kind of like being in the intelligence community. There are no former intelligence officials, right? They never retire. Well, it's kind of the same thing here. It's the very fact that they have the credibility as a former X, Y, and Z in the Obama administration or elsewhere. It's their unofficial status. They're still doing exactly what they're doing. They're just not doing it for government. And they're not doing it for government for the reason that we were talking about earlier, like the NGOs, where they serve as off the books. I think about it like a legal NGO. That's kind of what they are. And they're all funded by, by the way, Soros also helps to fund these guys. So like Eisen's reports for the Fannie Willis investigation, 300-page report there. You have to dig for it. It's not at the beginning. It's not at the end. It's on page, I think it's on page 227. But there's an acknowledgement section kind of in the 2/3 of the way through the report. And it's Brookings, it's Crew, and it's Open Society Foundation. So those are the big funders of these organizations.
And we, of course, knew of Soros, and Soros, in a way, I'm using his name as sort of general. I don't only mean him, I mean him as well, but there are, many like him who take over government functions via NGOs. And this has been known for a long time and so on. And we'll come back to the Ukraine example here in a moment, once we've, talked about Eisen and the lawfare. But I think particularly looking at the lawfare, looking at the 2020 election fortification, Mark Zuckerberg taking over government functions, we've just reached a whole new level of evilness. I don't think there's another word for it. And it's extremely dangerous. It's extremely bad, because Soros messing around with some NGOs was kind of bad enough. But now we're talking about prosecuting a former president, putting a lot of people in jail, the January 6th people, on totally specious grounds. And obviously the 2020 election, there's no bigger thing, isn't there, than just undermining the entire democratic process. And we all know they've cooked up, well, you talked about it in your, before, that you have, in 2024, they've already got all these plans. How are they going to, Witz and Eisen and everyone, how we're going to swing this thing, how we're going to make sure that Trump doesn't win. And once you have these outside groups doing that, it's really curtains on the country, because those are like, administering an election is the highest possible government role there is. There should be no private role of any kind in administering an election. That's the whole point of it. And I am perfectly cognizant of the fact that government running it isn't good either right now, because government is deep state, and deep state is run by Democrats and people like that, basically leftist sort of operatives. But at least theoretically, if you could sort of fix that a little bit, you could sort of swing it back into shape. But you're never ever going to swing it back into shape if private people are running these government functions. It just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, and Norman Eisen, another thing that he was involved with was the war games that were done, the DNC war games for the 2020 election. And what's notable about these war games, there was a number of them, and there was sort of a prelude to it. There was a paper that was written by a guy named Bill Foley, who's a constitutional legal guy, and he's the originator of the blue shift theory. The blue shift theory says that Democrat votes come in late and that miraculously Dem candidates come from behind after the election's officially closed to win. And he laid out a series of predictions that were then picked up by Eisen. And every one of these predictions is alarmingly disturbing. They describe in acute detail exactly what happened. That the election, came down to the wire, that Trump went into election night well ahead. And then miraculously Biden comes from behind, and then Trump claims, he contests the election. All of this was predicted by Dems well in advance. Well, how is that? Seems kind of strange that they would be so prescient and so specific. And indeed, Eisen was one of these people that did that. Then, you talk about these other efforts. There's another guy that a lot of people I don't think know of who's got a part in all this. His name is Mike Podhoser. I might be mispronouncing his name, but he's a very, very high-level DNC operative. And again, you don't hear about him that much, but he is the guy that ran the 2020 election efforts against Trump. So if you want to go back to that, think about that Time article, the shadow campaign. The person that was directing all of those efforts was Podhoser, and he was working very closely with Norm Eisen. So, it is an enormous threat. And it's also deeply disturbing that the GOP doesn't do anything about this. There's never any pushback. I sent a tweet the other day asking, has anybody even thought to look into Podhoser and see what he did, investigate, his actions? The GOP just does nothing. There's no strategic advantage here, while Democrats are insanely organized, unbelievably so. And I'm sure you and I, there's more we're not talking about, but I'm sure you and I only know a small part of it. I'm sure there's so much more that we're unaware of. Those efforts, election efforts, are ongoing. Mary McCord was fingered in, I think it was a Politico article about maybe it was an NBC article a couple months back. And basically she was identified as being a leader of the current outside legal efforts against Trump, the ones that are basically planning for if Trump wins. So right now, in my mind, there's two efforts going on currently. One is the legal efforts to, keep Trump from campaigning, and I think their ultimate goal, they'd love it if they could get him behind bars. They probably think that's not possible. And then there's the second tier effort that's going on for what if Trump wins? How do we hamper his presidency all over again? So we're seeing round two, the next stage of this all over again.
And, you put your finger right on it. Everything has been foretold, predicted, and then it turned out exactly like it was predicted. And that makes it all the more frustrating that there's no pushback from the people who ought to be pushing back, like the GOP. You already know the playbook. It's been given to you. They're telling you what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the GOP. I think it's also the media that, the right-leaning media or the truthful media, whatever you want to call it, independent media. There's not enough about that in there either. I mean, I know you've been talking about it a lot on your Twitter. We just did that article on Substack about this precise issue. But it just ought to be a lot more. People ought to be made aware of this because, as we were saying, I mean, if people just take away one thing from all this, it's the fact that private groups have taken over the most sacred government functions without any checks, balances, controls, accountability, anything whatsoever. And that is an absolutely terrible place to be. And it's a one-way street. There's no way back from that. So yeah, pushback would be nice.
Yeah, there's a reason why, you mentioned the media's role. There's a reason why the media hires these people. There's a reason why the media hires people like John Brennan, former intelligence community officials, why they hire these, very specific legal minds and put them in places of prestige so they can run sort of a publicity campaign for their behind-the-scenes shadow campaign. There's a reason. Remember the Hunter laptop? There was a war game that was a DNC war game that was done in August and in September that literally war gamed out the public disclosure of Hunter Biden's laptop and how to respond for that and how to cover it up. One of the participants in that was none other than Ella Nakashima, longtime deep state reporter for the Washington Post. She was part of this. She knew that the Hunter Biden laptop was real. She knew of it certainly no later than August, but probably earlier than that, had a copy of it. And she never wrote about it. She wrote about everything else but that. But she was literally part of those war games as to how do we deal with the disclosure of the Hunter Biden laptop. And this is a reporter for the Washington Post. So, if you want to point to one distinct element of their participation, the media's direct participation in that stuff, to me, that always jumps to mind, to see the way that they're actively working behind the scenes.
Exactly. And, when you say that, I'm also thinking of what accusations are there about, say, election interference, right? It's always sort of on the periphery to divert attention from where it really is. So how often have we heard, oh, Russia interfered in the election or whatever, there was this recent article about Trump having interfered in the election because the National Enquirer ran a story, and it's just like, any kind of election interference that is being talked about in the fake news bears no comparison to the actual election interference done by people like Eisen, Witz, and Zuckerberg, and all the stuff we've talked about. It's like a gazillion times worse. I mean, it's not even on the same. It's not even in the same universe in terms of its impact. I mean, one thing done by these lawfare types is worth 1,000 articles in National Enquirer or wherever. That is, and then unfortunately, sort of the so-called right-wing media always then gets stuck on these wrong issues instead of focusing on the bad stuff. And to be honest, I don't know. Have you seen some really good reporting on this? And I don't only mean specifically like Eisen did this, or most people don't even know who Eisen is. So I've kind of just answered my own question here. But just do you think there's been any reporting on the general problem and how massively huge this is? And by the way, you can tie this in with TikTok, and many Chinese interference, whatever. Yeah, TikTok is terrible. But again, what these people do, in my view, is a gazillion times worse. And it's domestic. That's the biggest problem. It's not some outside, it's not some foreigner coming in and throwing the election upside down or whatever. No, this is internal division making, an internal takeover of elections, of prosecutions, and so on. Anyway, sorry. Do you think the media has covered this at all? And I mean the good media?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. One thing is you and we've written about this. I've written about Eisen, I would say at least 5 different times. But I'm sure there's some other coverage of that. But most of what I see is outrage on Twitter as opposed to an actual responsive media attack. So the basic answer is no. And what I would also note is that some of the biggest disclosures that have gotten attention on the right have actually come from these one-off media articles by the left. Once again, pointing fingers to the Time magazine article, which described probably in a lot more detail than they should have done some of the election efforts. The more recent article, again, I think it was by ABC, where Mary McCord's name comes up. And in part, what I view those articles as is almost warnings to their own crew. Like, okay, we're going to disclose a little bit more than we need to, but it's sort of a clarion call it's a widespread call. Those articles aren't written for us. We get some extra details, but they're written for all the operatives that are loosely spread out and operating. So that's the long answer. The short answer is no, is that right-wing media has done an absolutely terrible job of exploring this stuff. It's almost as if much of the right-wing media, they don't want to be tainted as being conspiracy theorists. They're so worried about that, they don't want to touch it. When we first did that first article on Eisen and his work with Mueller and Trump impeachment, again, going back to 2019, it was early 2019, I think that was viewed as almost heretical. Like, what are you talking about? That's crazy talk. So there's this sort of effete, gentlemanly response from the right-wing media that they don't want to get tainted. They aren't willing to get into the trenches.
Yeah, although just empirically, data-based, if you take Brookings Lawfare, their blog, and you take the dates and you can look when they publish certain things, and you can always see there's a bit of a lag, and then these exact things would happen, say, in the Mueller investigation. It would just kind of, oh, great, they gave us our playbook, let's do that. And then 2 months later, it happens. So it can be actually empirically proven. This is not just us theorizing that the connect between those two things.
Oh, no, there's whole timelines that hold up. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So it's extremely frustrating that, and I agree with you, by the way, that this is one of the frustrating things. I think in the Time magazine article, they kind of let the cat out of the bag. I was obviously very happy. It was like, oh, they admitted it. They fortified the election. They described exactly how they did it. They described how they used all the Zuckerberg money to take over official election functions in various, not in specific, I mean, not in just any random states, in the specific states where they needed Biden to do well. So that, again, was not, that should have been curtains for their scheming, because the honest media should have reported it, and they did, but they should have just hammered on and on and about it, and then the GOP should have taken it up and to try and curtail these things. But as you say, instead of, they definitely let the cat out of the bag. I think at the time I thought, oops, someone made a mistake here. But maybe it wasn't a mistake because there haven't really been any consequences. Now, I'll give you the counterexample of how Democrats do this when a GOP type does something stupid and lets the cat out of the bag. And the GOP type didn't even do anything illegal. They were just smart. That was Brad Parscale. Remember Trump's campaign manager before he was fired? And in 2016, he was the digital manager. Now, that guy, obviously he's got problems, no question about it, but that guy is a really smart cookie, and he came up with a brilliant plan in 2016. What they did is they targeted Facebook ads to particular audiences, and they were able to exploit the algorithm for that purpose. Now, Facebook does that with all advertisers. It's not illegal. It's not something, it's not anything special. Facebook will target certain people who might want to see certain ads, and it could be about anything. It's not about politics in particular. It could be about buying a new car or whatever, right? And Pascal was very smart in how he used that system to target the exact voters they were looking for in the exact places they were looking for those voters, like Wisconsin and so on. And it worked like a charm. It was brilliant. But then in 2017, we can go back and have a look at that. He unfortunately felt he had to brag. He should have just kept his mouth shut, right? And then he bragged, and he did that big article explaining in minute detail everything that he had done. Okay, so to me, that's sort of the parallel of what happened with the Time magazine with the fortification in 2020 and 2021. Well, guess what? The Democrats didn't just see, oh, Pascal, look, he just let the cat out of the bag, whatever, and move on. No, they didn't do that. They immediately targeted Facebook. Remember that? And they accused Facebook of election interference and so on. Of course, they didn't say, oh, you shouldn't have let Pascal do that. What they did is you had Russians on your site and you had this, and they really turned the screws on Facebook. And that was in direct kind of retaliation for Pascal having done such a great job in 2016. And what did Facebook do? Well, they started, censoring, shutting down, and all these other kinds of things. It's not just Facebook, it's Twitter, old Twitter, Instagram, and so on. So that's the difference between a Republican kind of letting the secret out and Democrats immediately go and shut it down, and the Democrats letting out the secret and Republicans don't do a thing.
Well, it goes even further than that, because like you said, they put the screws to Facebook, right? What they left out of the entire story was that Facebook gave the DNC their entire user data. They had access to that in the entirety of the database, way more than Pascal ever was able. What he accomplished was amazing in terms of his fine tuning. The DNC had access to everything from Facebook all along, and they never talked about that. Literally to the level that it always amazed me that wasn't considered an in-kind contribution from Facebook to the DNC. So, at the same time that they're operating on the level that Pascal was times 5 in terms of having complete access to every single user, the entirety of the database, they go after Pascal and Facebook and chastise Facebook while they've done much, much worse. So, that's just kind of their modus operandi. Maybe at this point, It makes sense to switch over to the NGOs for a brief little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of those where, you've done a lot of work into that, in particular with immigration and so on. Maybe I can just start it off here. The one that still, just every time I think of it, it's frustrating. Especially that people don't know about it. It's the Ukraine NGOs, which were funded by Newland and the State Department, basically U.S. taxpayer money. And They were doing the work over there of advancing, the coup, the 2014 coup, where the Biden approved coup, where they chucked out Yanukovych, the elected, talking about democracy, right? The democratically elected president of Ukraine was chucked out by Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland. And then all the stuff they did after that, trying to steer that country in a certain direction, getting the prosecutor fired. Whom did they have on the ground to sort of back them up? Because Ukrainians didn't think that the prosecutor was bad. He was one of the few good ones. Well, they hired a bunch of NGOs, and the NGOs issued some statements. The NGOs did some picket, and they held up, some posters. You can see the posters where they were not organic. They were all printed from the same printer. This was all done by NGOs. What's like, for instance, just before the 2014 coup, Victoria Nuland got $5 billion with a B dollars to dole out over there to these kinds of groups to run their policy. Again, without any oversight, without any accountability, without any checks and balances, without anything whatsoever. And then when so the Ukrainian prosecutor under, I think it was under Shokin, in fact, but it doesn't really matter who it was under, actually noticed that some of these NGOs misappropriated money, which I'm sure a lot of them do. And they wanted to investigate that. And what happened is that George Kent, we have the email from the embassy. He was the charge d'affaires in Ukraine at the U.S. embassy, the bow tie guy, right? He told the prosecutors to cut it out. Said, don't investigate the NGOs, because the NGOs have gotten $5 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to mold policy, to do things over there kind of under the table.
George Kent's also the same guy who knew that the prosecutor before Shokin was paid this huge bribe to end the investigation into Burisma. Yeah, he knew that all along. I'm curious what you think. I've always thought of the NGOs as sort of having two levels to them. And the one, I don't want to say innocent because that's not the right term, but it would be sort of DNC activists. But I also think there's a darker side to it, and that NGOs can oftentimes be used by the intelligence community. And so the amount of funding that can go into these, like you mentioned, the $5 billion, people don't realize how big this is. And it just is so infuriating in its sources. It almost always comes from the State Department, although it comes from other federal agencies as well. And it's part of their overall budget. They get a huge portion of their budget as sort of this gray area. And they can donate to the UN, as we talked about in a previous show. The actual contributions from the United States to the UN are more than double the technical contributions, what we give to the UN as part of our overall budget. Why? Because the DOJ, the State Department, any of the federal agencies have the ability to carve out a portion of their budget and allocate it where they want to allocate it. And all of that is always used in some way, shape, or form for a variety of NGOs. And I think people are beginning to become a little bit more aware, but it's the NGOs that are driving the illegal immigration into our country. There's an entire chain that's built all the way down into Central America that's, like way stations that hands out money, hands out debit cards, provides transportation. These aren't people that are walking from Central America up to the U.S. They're being funneled through in a very organized fashion. And once they get here, these same NGOs on the U.S. side then distribute them more or less evenly. If you look at it by congressional district, it is evenly. Distribute them throughout the entirety of the United States. And, the fake border bill that was brought forward that didn't get passed, thankfully, it included about $3.8 billion in funding for these very NGOs. Now, and we tried to raise that issue, and we were glad to see that the fake border bill didn't go through, but they wanted that money in there so badly that it was included in the most recent funding that just did make it through Congress for Israel, for Ukraine, for Taiwan. Embedded in that is a provision for I think now it's 3.7, but same basic number that's directly for these NGOs. This happens every time. And it's been going on forever, and I just don't think we ever knew to really look or pay enough attention to it. So, it's a form of shadow government. NGOs should not be allowed, but it's a form of shadow government, and it's used by the intelligence community, and it's used by, sort of the bureaucratic side of it, State Department, et cetera.
So, to get back to your question there, I agree. I mean, it's not just kind of nefariousness on the part of people like Newland who want to form and shape Ukraine in some way. It's the intelligence services as well who use these same groups as front groups. I'd say it's probably a mix, and it has to be a mix because you have to kind of hide the front groups amongst the goody two shoes. That's the other thing about it. You do have these leftist activists whose brains are just kind of, twisted because of, I don't know, schooling or whatever it is. And they actually believe this stuff. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's people who believe this stuff and they're perfect. People who believe this stuff they're absolutely perfect because you can put them out there in front of the cameras or whatever. They're just going to yap away and they are true believers. And then you can use them either to mold or for some IC purposes, whereby the IC and the State Department molding and so on. And at the end of the day, it's often the same thing that they're trying to do. Say the coup, whatever else you're talking about, the immigration, the green agenda. I mean, you can come up with so many different things. It's basically information wars. You're using these people to mold the narrative to achieve certain goals. And I agree with you. It can come from the IC. It can come from state. It doesn't really matter in the end. And what's so important is I'm sure there's operatives among these NGOs who are not just goody two-shoes, leftist activists who actually believe this stuff. There's plenty of them. But you do need the ones, the true believers, because they make the whole charade look real. And the people who see the stuff on TV think, well, that's a real activist, and we should support that because they're genuinely behind this and whatever. It's completely twisted. It's frustrating talking about it because the NGO part has been around for such a long time, and I'll admit, for instance, all the work you did on these on the immigration. I was not aware of the extent of it. I mean, I knew it's some guy in Guatemala isn't just going to pack his bags one day and start walking like a couple of thousand miles or whatever. They need support. They need to cross borders. They need to have bus rides. They need to be fed. They need this, and the other, right? So, but you did some fantastic work there on actually getting to the bottom of how that works, the nitty gritty, and that is all funded by these by taxpayers through these NGOs. But generally speaking, I think the NGO problem has been known for a long time. Again, just think of Soros. But what's new, and what to me is really the biggest takeaway of these past few maybe months or so, certainly weeks, especially with these new Eisen disclosures, is how brazen things are now. It's no longer hidden behind some NGO front and some goody two-shoes true believer or whatever. It's totally brazen. It's like, here's the playbook on how to prosecute Trump. Here's the playbook on how to make sure Trump doesn't win and whatever. It's just out in the open. This third-party takeover of government functions is out there, and anyone can see that that's exactly what's going on. They're not hiding it anymore.
Yeah, when I was doing that work, I was astonished at the amount of money that was being distributed, billions upon billions of dollars. And the most of the network that makes up the immigration kind of channel, if you will, is primarily, if you wanted to identify one thing, it's the Catholic Church. They're the largest element. And so, as you said, you have this organic base of true believers. All it takes is a few well-placed organizers to kind of get things going. As to the brazenness of it, yes, I think that probably typifies everything that's been going on in our politics over the last 10 years, is there's been this push to move not only to the full possible extent of the legal aspect of it, but then realize, hey, we can actually break through that barrier and go even further because nobody's stopping us. And unfortunately, you hit a point where that begins to perpetuate itself. And the ramifications of that are what I believe we're seeing right now, which is this kind of fundamental breakdown in the traditional roles of government. Everything that was held sacrosanct no longer is. Not only can the boundaries be pushed, but they can be exceeded and they can even be broken. And guess what? The more that you break of those boundaries, the less there is of anybody to stop you from doing so. It leads to a constitutional breakdown.
Yeah, and the last point I'd make here is because the GOP has been so useless and the right-wing media, for want of a better word, has been so useless And as you say, if there's no pushback, they'll take more. And you still don't push back, they'll take more, and they'll just keep taking more and more and more.
But then again, I think it's an important point. You hit this irony where once they've taken so much, it becomes its own thing. The rules sort of go out the window and it can be applied everywhere. And I kind of think that's where we're at right now.
The only wall left is the Supreme Court, as we're seeing right now with 1512 and various other issues. That's the only one that's left. And that's not a good one, because you're replacing some, bad people, some good people with bad people over the years. Eventually, this won't hold. That's not a good enough of a wall there.
Yeah, people think about the Supreme Court as this sort of institutional bulwark, if you will. And what I worry about, and it came to mind in the recent First Amendment case that still is within the Supreme Court right now, public arguments were a few weeks back, is that we have these what are potentially incredibly important cases coming before the Supreme Court, and they could hinge on the opinion of one single person that then has these constitutionally altering decisions that reverberate throughout the entirety of the United States. So if that's our only defense, you always have to think about it, that these are just people and there's only 9 of them. And the fact that you can have a change in makeup and that can lead to a fundamental change for everything that's going on in our nation. Literally, a First Amendment case. It could dramatically change the way the First Amendment is viewed. That frightens me, that's our only last stop.